Remember, for something to be considered reinforcement, it must have these two qualities. They both must be present. It must follow the behavior, therefore it is a consequence. And that behavior must increase in the future. So again, for something to be considered reinforcement, it must follow the behavior, therefore a consequence. And that behavior must increase in the future. There are two types of reinforcement that we are going to discuss: positive and negative reinforcement. Both increase the future likelihood of behavior. Positive reinforcement occurs when the behavior is reinforced due to the addition of a stimulus or reinforcer. For example, if I tell someone to clap their hands and they clap their hands and I give them an M&M, and they are more likely in the future to clap their hands because I give them M&Ms, the M&M is acting as a positive reinforcer because the person is getting that M&M. They're gaining it. Negative reinforcement works on the removal of something the person doesn't like or an aversive stimulus. So, when my alarm clock goes off in the morning, my behavior of swiping the screen to turn the alarm clock off has been negatively reinforced. The behavior of swiping the screen removes the alarm clock going off. It removes the aversive stimulus. Reinforcement is based on the idea of operant behavior. Operant behavior: any behavior whose future frequency is determined by its history of consequences. In other words, a behavior that you do and how much you do it is based by what it gets you. Behaviors whose future likelihood is determined by what it gets or doesn't get the individual. Operant behavior. An example of operant behavior would be turning the water on in a faucet. You are not born knowing how to turn the sink handle to have water come out. But because of your history with it, turn handle, water comes out, you know how to do it. Imagine a world where sink handles did absolutely nothing. While some people might actually turn them, the rate would be much, much lower because it doesn't get anyone anything. So again, operant behavior is based on what it gets or doesn't get the person. It's a learned history. You basically have to have a learning history with it. If you think about your or all of human development, a vast majority of behaviors that we are engaging in are operant. We learn how to do them because they get us something, or they remove something we don't like. None of us are born knowing how to operate an iPhone. None of us are born with some capability to automatically know how to use a computer or drive a car. These are all learned behaviors because of what it gets the person, or what it doesn't get them, or removes something that's bad. The idea of operant conditioning is based on what's known as a functional consequence, a stimulus change that follows a behavior closely and alters the frequency of that behavior in the future. What that means is that what happens after a behavior, something happens. When you do that behavior, you get something or something is removed, and this alters how much you will do that in the future. So, a functional consequence is just something that when we engage in the behavior, something occurs that will either make us do the behavior more in the future or less in the future. Operant conditioning example. So, I press the button on the TV, the power button. TV turns on immediately. I am more likely to press that button in the future due to the stimulus change that pressing the button led to, the TV turning on. So remember, the behavior of pressing the power button, the frequency of me doing that is going to increase due to the fact that it causes the stimulus change, which is the TV turning on. You can think of a myriad of examples of what we do as humans, what you may do, that this applies to. In 1953, B.F. Skinner was talking about operant conditioning. Whereas you strengthen an operant, it makes the response more probable and more frequent. If this sounds familiar, it's because this is the basis for reinforcement. When operant conditioning leads to an increase in response frequency, in other words, a behavior increases based on what it gets the person, either giving them something or removing something negative, we have that idea of reinforcement. Consequences, meaning after the behavior, right, only affect future behavior. We cannot tell if something was reinforced until we see if it actually increases based on the response or based on the consequence. So, if you're working with a patient and they have a new behavior, they engage in some new behavior, and you provide a reinforcing consequence for that, we cannot actually say whether that person was reinforced or not, because we don't know what the future likelihood of that behavior looks like. Likewise, an issue I see a lot is a kid will engage or a patient will engage in some new problem behavior, and the parent will say, I don't know what I did to reinforce that, but it's a new problem behavior. We don't know if it's going to happen again. We don't know if the person will actually engage in that behavior anymore. So we can't actually say we reinforced it. It could have just been a one-off behavior that day. The point is that when we're talking about consequences and reinforcement specifically, we are only talking about the future behavior. For something to be reinforcing, it has to affect future behavior. So, if I say that I'm going to give my kids $5 to clean their room to reinforce them, I am technically incorrect. I would have to wait and see if that $5 actually increases the future likelihood of them wanting to clean their room. So maybe I give them the $5 after they clean their room, and then the next time I ask them to clean their rooms, they don't do it. Or they complain, or they don't do it as well as I wanted them to. At that point, I could say the $5 was not reinforcing. But if I give them $5, so let's say in another example, I give them $5 to clean their room, and the next time I ask them to, they rapidly do it, and they want to do it, I give them the $5, and then the next time I ask them, and they even more want to clean their room, then I can say that $5 is acting as a reinforcer. The point is, though, as an RBT, and for understanding this, reinforcement is only talking about, we can only know if it's reinforcement if we know about the future likelihood of the behavior. So, is this reinforcement? You give your patient access to their favorite toy for correctly identifying the color blue. Is it reinforcement? Well, let's see. It meets the first requirement. It comes after the behavior, identifying blue. But what about the second requirement? We don't know yet. We don't know if it's actually going to increase the likelihood of the behavior of them identifying blue. So we cannot say that you reinforced your patient. All we can say is that you provided them a consequence for identifying the color blue. But we cannot say that giving access to the toy was a reinforcement. We can only say that giving access to the toy was a consequence for them correctly identifying the color blue. So let's look at this example. Your patient is not attending to you. You show your patient a picture of his favorite cartoon character. He then gets 10 questions right in a row. Is showing the favorite cartoon character reinforcement? Well, let's see. The second criteria is met. The responses are increasing. He got 10 questions right in a row. Before, he'd only gotten 0 questions right. But showing the cartoon character was not a reinforcer because it was shown before the instructions were given. Therefore, it is not a consequence. Here, showing the cartoon character was more like an antecedent intervention. It basically got him to attend to your instructions. Therefore, it would not be a reinforcer because it was occurring before the behavior. It did not come after the behavior of picking the correct responses. So remember, both criteria have to be met. It has to increase the future likelihood of the behavior, and it has to come after a response. Here's another example of something that looks like reinforcement but is not. The RBT asks his patient to touch his head. The patient touches his head and the RBT provides a token and some social reinforcement. Great job touching your head. The patient then gets 80% correct on the trials. We don't know what the future likelihood of the behavior is, however. We only know that he got 80% correct this time. Maybe he got 100% yesterday, or maybe he'll only get 60% correct tomorrow. We don't know. The point is that we need to know what the future likelihood of the behavior is. In this example, the person, we only know they got 80% correct. That's all we know. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We don't know what happened yesterday. This is a reinforcement. The RBT asks his patient to touch his head. The patient touches his head, and the RBT provides a token and some social reinforcement. The patient then gets 80% correct on the trials. In the next set of trials, he also uses tokens to serve as reinforcement. The patient then gets 100% correct. So in this example, we can see that the correct rate, the frequency of the responding, is getting higher. It went from 80% to 100%. It is increasing the future likelihood of the behavior, and the tokens were coming after the behavior of the individual touching their head. Using reinforcement throughout the session. Remember, we are not just reinforcing correct responses to our questions. We should also be striving to reinforce the patient attending to us, wanting to be around us, and sitting and doing program, as well as engaging in any other good and desirable behaviors. Remember, as an RBT, you are providing an enriched environment. This means you are attending to things that most normal or typical environments would not attend to. And when I say that, I mean it is not a natural thing to tell a kid or tell a patient, good job for every little thing they do. But remember, we are providing an enriched environment where we are trying to build these skills up. And we know that reinforcement works throughout the day. So we need to attend to those little things then most people would not to build those skills up. Now, of course, you're not always going to be doing that. Once that person starts doing it more and more frequently, we can fade back all that kind of reinforcement. But the point is, as an RBT, you are providing an enriched environment. That means you are reinforcing behaviors that normal environments, natural environments, typically wouldn't pick up on or would just expect the person to be able to do. For example, look at eye contact. Most people expect people to make eye contact, but a person with autism or another developmental disability may have difficulty making eye contact. So, in an enriched environment, every time that person makes eye contact, you should throw a little party for them. Hey, great job looking at me. Awesome work. That's not something you would normally hear throughout the day in a normal environment, but because we are providing that enriched environment, we should strive to do that. During rapport building, try to find what works for that individual. Often, just being fun and playful, or making silly noises, or some sort of funny voice can be enough for that person to want to attend to you. Again, it's going to depend on the patient, and this involves lots of communication with both the supervisor of the case, the analyst, and other technicians working on that case. The point is, though, if you understand that reinforcement increases likelihood of behavior, we should be striving to use that for all desirable behaviors throughout the session, not just when we're working with stimuli or on programs. Reinforcement contingencies, or the idea of a contingency. A contingency is sort of like a contract. If you do this, you get this. Where this happens, this happens. As an RBT, strive to be predictable and consistent. Don't let the patient control the session, but rather provide reinforcement type actions for the desirable behavior. Ignore or redirect undesirable behavior. Remember, as an RBT, you can control the antecedents and the consequences. Don't let that person, the patient, get access to reinforcement or other desirable items for engaging in undesirable or problematic behavior. Remember, you are the RBT. The patient is not in control of the session. You are guiding the session. Yes, they are going to sometimes engage in behaviors that are problematic. It is your role as an RBT to use behavior management skills and reinforcement skills to promote desirable behavior and to ignore or redirect the undesirable behavior. And remember to develop those contingencies with the individual. If you do this, this will happen. First we do this, then this. Remember, a contingency is like a contract. Basically saying that when this happens, if you do this, this happens. Or when this happens, this happens. First, you have to do this, then this happens. So, what are reinforcers? Reinforcers are the items or activities or actions that you will use to reinforce correct responses. Honestly, they can be just about anything. I have used pictures of ceiling fans. I have used staplers. I have used marbles as reinforcers. I have used silly voices, drawings, toys, praise, just about anything. But of course there are some considerations that you want to make. Reinforcers should be easy to deliver. They should be small enough to be able to transport or hide. Basically, you have to be able to be in control of them. They should not readily be available for that patient throughout the day. Otherwise, remember, they won't be in that deprivation state. I put on here they shouldn't be too pricey, because if we have to get them, right, If we have to buy some of them for reinforcement, we don't want to spend tons of money doing that. They shouldn't be something that are really that the person is really resistant to giving back once they have access to it. So if you use an item but they have a 10-minute tantrum every single time you have to get it back, then that's probably going to be counterproductive for the session. And it should be something that can be enjoyed for a few seconds, because you're probably going to have to get it back from them pretty quickly. Remember, we're trying to do as many trials as we possibly can. And something I didn't put on here is that they should be approved by the parent or the guardian. For example, I was working with a patient one time. Chocolate chips were very reinforcing for that patient. They would do just about anything for them. But the parent didn't want the person to eat sugar, so we had to stop. Even though they were good reinforcers, because the parent or guardian didn't want us to do it. Remember, it's their child. It's their patient. They are responsible for them. We listen to them. So that is one consideration you should definitely take as well. So, when to use reinforcement? We use reinforcement throughout the session. We use it for correct responses. At the beginning or for difficult tasks, we're probably going to be reinforcing every single correct response. For known responses or stuff that is not difficult for the learner, we can do every 2 to 3 responses or more. Again, though, this is very difficult to say. I don't know what kind of patient you'll be working with. And remember, we can always give some sort of social response or some sort of acknowledgement that the person got it right. I use smiles and high fives and thumbs up a lot. The point is, though, is that for those hard tasks or difficult tasks, we want to give higher levels of reinforcement. And for known or easier tasks, probably lower levels or less frequent reinforcement. When not to use reinforcement. Of course, after they engage in a problem behavior, we don't want to reinforce problem behavior. One time when I was first doing this, a kid hit me on the head, and I basically said, "Ouch, that kind of hurt. Here, play with this while I write out this incident report." So I reinforced that child, that patient, for hitting me on the head. So again, we want to avoid using any kind of reinforcement when that person is engaging in problematic behavior. We don't want to inadvertently reinforce the problem behavior. As an RBT, you will use contingencies of reinforcement to work on skill acquisition, also known as teaching skills. Again, as an RBT, you will use this contingencies of reinforcement, to work on teaching them items that address the skill deficits in their lives. So basically, whatever they need help with, we're going to be using reinforcement contingencies to improve their skill set. Now, within reinforcement, there are 2 big types of schedules of reinforcement: variable or intermittent, and continuous. These general categories are going to be discussed next. Within intermittent reinforcement, there are 2 broad categories: ratio and intervals. Ratios are the number of responses needed. This means that we're going to give reinforcement dependent on the number of responses, whatever that is. So, we might say something like, we'll reinforce in a ratio of every 3 responses. So for every 3 correct responses, that person will get reinforced. Intervals, on the other hand, require a time frame. The reinforcement is dependent on the amount of time passing. Okay? Once that time is passed, the first correct behavior after that time is reinforced. Okay? We might say something like, we're going to reinforce every target item, or we're going to reinforce one target item after the 3 minutes. So, and then after that correct response, we start the 3-minute interval again. So again, we reinforce the first correct target behavior after the interval. Once that's happened, we start the interval over. Variable or intermittent reinforcement means that we're not giving reinforcement for every response. This is good for responses that are already established, or the person already has the skills in their repertoire, or the skill is very easy for them. Here's an example of what intermittent reinforcement might look like. We provide Jerry with reinforcement for every few responses in this example. So the RBT says, "Where's the car?" The patient touches the car. Then they say, "Where's the horse?" The patient touches the horse. The RBT reinforces. "Where's the house?" The patient touches house. "Where's the airplane?" The patient touches the airplane. And then finally the RBT says, "Where's the apple?" And the patient touches the apple. And the RBT reinforces. So as you can see here, the RBT is not reinforcing every correct response. This would be intermittent reinforcement. Variable reinforcement on a fixed ratio. This establishes the criteria for a number of responses and stays consistent. So if it is a fixed ratio of 3, also denoted by FR3, we're going to reinforce every third correct response. For example, I would say touch nose, they would touch nose, touch eye, they touch eyes, and then say touch ears, and once they touch ears, I would say, "Hey, awesome job, you know your body parts." Okay, so I'm reinforcing every third correct response. A variable ratio, on the other hand, also establishes a criteria for number of responses, and this will also stay consistent. Okay, so if it is a variable ratio 5, VR5, we're going to reinforce, on average, every fifth response. So that could be the 7th response or the 3rd response. It could be the 10th or the 1st. As long as over the time frame that you're doing this, it averages out to 5. Variable reinforcement and variable ratio can produce a very strong response rate. If you think about gambling, okay, why do people continue to gamble, or why do you flip through Netflix? At some point, I don't know what a good example of this, but what is actually a good example? Because every once in a while it pays off. Okay, going through Netflix, every once in a while you find a really good movie that you want to watch. Okay. This type of variable reinforcement is going to be very strong. Okay, because it produces strong responses because it pays off every once in a while. The point in variable ratio, though, is that ratio stays consistent. You have a VR5, so that means on average every 5th response. So like I said, it could be the 1st response or the 10th response. There's also the fixed interval. Okay. So if it's a fixed interval, say fixed interval 2, we're going to reinforce the first correct response after 2 minutes. So after the correct response, the interval starts over. In variable interval, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to reinforce after a certain amount of time, but on average it's going to be that like 3 minutes. Okay, so if we have a VI 3, which is variable interval 3, we're going to reinforce after intervals to average out to 3 minutes. So some of those intervals might be 2 minutes, some may be 5, some may be 6, some may be 1. Just needs to average out to 3.